Hi, welcome to the APC webinar. My name is Nicole Matthews, and I'll be available to assist with most technical issues that may arise today. If you experience a technical problem, please send a message through the Q&A box located at the bottom right side of your monitor. Or you can email me at nmathews@same.org. Lastly, you can also call WebEx directly at 1-866-779-3239. As I turn over our webinar to our moderator, Rad Delaney, you'll see a brief poll appear. Please take a moment to answer the questions. Thank you for your participation, and now I'll hand it over to Rad.
Thanks, Nicole. I'm Rad Delaney, a client service lead with CDM Smith and the Vice Chair for Professional Education Programs for the SAME Architectural Practice Committee. I'll be moderating today's webinar. I hope you find our information valuable to you and your organization. Besides today's program, the Architectural Practice Committee also offers 1-hour AIA CEU presentations associated with our quarterly calls. These calls are open to all and are free of charge. Our next quarterly call is scheduled for next Wednesday, October 26th. The presenter will be Rachel Minery from the American Institute of Architects Resiliency Program. You can go to the APC website for more information. On behalf of SAME and the Architectural Practice Committee, welcome to our webinar entitled Designing Federal Facilities to Enhance Organizational Creativity and Collaboration. Today's intergenerational technology-equipped workforce empowers us to work collaboratively, dispersedly, and in partnership. This affects and is affected by organizational structure and facility design. To bolster and complement our most valuable asset, people, we must design workspaces that integrate technology, provide varied and tailored spaces, and enable creative interaction while remaining adaptable to operational and industry changes. Today's presenters will be Jose Merguido, AIA, Chief Operating Officer and Partners, Zyscovich Architects, Mike McGuinn, AIA, Lead AP, Federal Program Manager and Principal, Zyscovich Architects, and Steve Williamson, PMP, Colonel U.S. Army retired, Strategic Partnerships and Government Relations, Zyscovich Architects. Also, Tom Pallas, Senior Associate, Booz Allen Hamilton, and Christine Hargreaves, AIA, Lead AP, Architect, Program Manager, CH2M Hill Military Government Facilities. And today is not the only time we'll be hearing from Christine. In their November-December issue, the Military Engineer will be publishing an article she authored on designing military intelligence facilities to enable mission effectiveness. I'm looking forward to today's presentation and to your questions and commentary afterwards. I encourage each of you to send in your questions as they arise during the presentation. Please type your questions in the Q&A chat box and submit to all panelists. We will answer as many questions as time allows. Regardless, all questions will be answered in written form and available for download along with the presentation on the SAME website after conclusion of the webinar. Watch for a follow-up email containing a link to the recording of today's proceedings. After our program, you'll be automatically routed to a survey page. Please participate in the short survey so that we can address your concerns for future webinars. I'll have closing remarks for you at the end of our program, but at this time, I'll pass the call over to Jose Merguido. Jose, thanks for presenting to us today.
My pleasure, Rad. Again, I'm Jose Merguido, and I'm a partner, of course, at the Zyscovich Architects, and this is the back of my business card. We make people places, and it's actually the back of everyone's business cards, which is kind of our North Star organizational statement that pretty much guides our urban design, architecture, and interiors practice. And I thought it'd be important to start with this because that's where creativity and collaboration takes place, is in physical spaces. And speaking of which, those are the spaces that are attracting the types of people that we want to have in our organizations. As an example of that, we wanted to share with the group the Wallace Creek Fitness Center. is this is something that was just completed a few years back at Camp Lejeune, and it was targeted precisely to bring into the military a very specific type of a new worker, if you will, or soldier or participant, which is really the asset that all industry is looking for. And it was about creating a signature place, people place, a place where the community could come together and share its fitness goals. It's cross-generational. It brought every age group into the facility. So this was something that was done specifically as a magnet to attract a very specific type of new employee, if you will, because this is what the military is competing with now, is trying to bring in the same type of professional that industry is looking for. So the facility itself was a place, a people place, to create the magnetic attraction to bring those people in. Next slide, please. And the reason that's important is because Steve is going to share with you what's going on in the federal workforce.
Thank you, Jose. I really appreciate that setup. And so what I'd like to do, folks, is I want to set this up for what follows in this presentation. Now, we all recognize that the federal government is facing a workforce gap. As many of the long-term employees with expertise and experience are retiring or becoming very close to the retirement age. This is creating a skills gap, an age gap, a generation gap, and particularly a culture gap. You know, the new workforce coming aboard is very different from the one that's leaving. And it's not just a matter of technological savviness. There are many ways to begin to adapt to our new workforce, but the bottom line is that we must attract them and we must retain them. So ahead, we will discuss specific ways that your organization can design facilities and spaces to attract and support the work habits of our up-and-coming workforce. There are currently 2.1 million federal government employees, 1.8 million of which are full-time. That's a lot of people working in the federal government, requiring the right facilities to do their job better and more integrated. But the key takeaway from this slide, and what we need to look at, are the peaks and troughs we face due to budget fluctuations. And it is estimated that due to sequestration over the next few years, we could expect to see the numbers go down even further than what you see there on the 2013 numbers. And each time we have a downturn like this, we lose some very talented people. And many times, it's our younger, less tenured workforce. So the result is a continuing aging workforce with a large age gap between our older and younger generations. A gap that we need to deal with now, but if we don't, it will definitely show its impact over time. The average years of service in federal government is about 14 years. You can see the agencies who have the longest tenure to the right. But you know, if you strip out the active duty military, the Department of Defense actually comes in at around 16.7 years for federal employees, civilians. There's no doubt that our current employees choose to work with the DoD for a long time. This is very different behavior from the up-and-coming millennial workforce. So we got to ask the question, how do we address the new work styles and environment demanded by these up-and-coming employees that we can expect to see in the federal government very soon? Currently, the greatest concentration of federal workers is between 45 years old and 59 years old. That makes up about 48% of the workforce. Right now, only 27% are under 40 years old. And if you look at it closely, only 17% are under 35. That kind of gives you an idea of the age of our workforce. Very soon, though, as we start to approach 2020 and we start to see some of our older workforce retire, because you can see there on the bar charts as they start to reach retirement age, it could be estimated that about 46% of our managers will be below 40 years old. That's a huge change. That's going to bring some significant, interesting dynamics to the way in which the federal government does work. So what's the impact? We have a huge workforce generation gap. Two generations who fundamentally approach work very differently. They lack the understanding, they lack collaboration, and they're not sure how to work together. But most importantly, as this slide depicts, they really lack the ability to communicate in the same language. So this is where we want to get to. Obviously working together, because all said and done, we work better together. So what we want to do is we want to see an intergenerational workforce blended as one and working together. And as we'll discuss throughout the presentation, we'll talk about how you can design your facilities and workspaces to support this critical goal. Because basically, your organizational success relies on this. Jose, let me move that back to you.
Thanks, Steve. In addition to the workforce that's changing, there's also the work itself. We call it fluid conditions. And a lot of the habits that the workforce has been shaped by the environments that they have been working in over the years. And of course, some of us may remember these types of spaces when technology was introduced, and of course, where spaces are today. But the nature of the work itself has changed in the sense that it's much more cognitively complex. We need to work with each other. It's much more team-based, which has a physical impact on space, as well as skills such as social skills that need to be harnessed and shaped within the space itself. And the other issue that seems to be pressing is that there's more to be done in less time. Time pressure is guiding a lot of the activity within those spaces. And of course, the mobile detached workforce. People are coming in, and now people are working from home. So that has all changed the dynamics of the work environment. So the challenge to industry has been to come up with a leaner, more agile environment, less square feet, have an awareness of the continual competition by the competitors in the market, and flat structures, less hierarchical, decision authority across various different categories. And another issue that has plagued some of the industry has been less likely to provide lifelong work opportunities. A lot of turnover in the workforce, and the continual reorganization of industry to take advantage of the competitive environment that they're in. So, to Steve's point, there's a fusion that's occurring in the labor force as we work between the older generation, for lack of a better word, and the new generations that are coming in. And a lot of the wiring, the sensibilities that comes with these generations, there's been a lot of research on that, and we're going to share some of that with you, give you a little bit of insight as to who it is that we're talking about. This is the generation I belong to, baby boomers. We were born before 1960, and there's a series of cultural dimensions that we all seem to have, that hardworking, work-centric, We're collaborative. But there's one thing that Steve had pointed out before, which is that over the next year, 3.6 million of these baby boomers are set to retire. So there's a new workforce coming in that has different sensibilities. And right behind them is the Generation X. These are the people that saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Vietnam War. They're also the digital immigrants. This generation is the generation that witnessed the creation of computing and are adapting to the impact on how they work. So it's a pre-technological innovation. They're open, they're diverse, they embrace different religions and races and genders. It's a very open-minded generation. The kids of the baby boomers, those that are born between 1980 and 2000, the digital natives are right behind the heels of the Generation Xers. And these have a different approach, they're different sensibilities. They're much more prone to fun and autonomy. They're confident, savvy. They're influenced by truth, driven by truth. Strong relationships with friends. There's a number of unifying characteristics of them. Next slide. Generation Z. Generation Z are the technoholics, the ones that are continually on social media. These are the ones that were born after 2000, the ones that tend to come to your visit home and put fingerprints on your TV thinking that it's an interactive screen. This generation is the one that is coming into the workforce in broad numbers. Next slide. So when we look at how they compare, one of the interesting things is that there's different drivers. The baby boomers are more team players. The Generation Xers are much more entrepreneurial. You can see Generation Y is participatory and Z is collaboratory. And so there's a lot of different motivations that are driving this workforce. So one of the questions is, how can we create synergies? How can we create collective direction with this diverse group of drivers? Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it to Steve to tell you some of the federal contracting challenges.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate that. And you know, we've addressed kind of the workforce challenges that some of our organizations are facing, and some ideas about what we can do to address them. And we're going to go even further down the road as we start talking about facility design and space design. But before we get there, obviously we're talking about federal facilities, and which means we always have to talk about the challenges with federal contracting. Many of you already know these issues and love these issues, and I'll put quotes around love. While there's so much that we'd like to do to design and build facilities to address the changing workforce and the changing demands, we are all still beholden to the laws, the regulations, the procedures, and the federal contracting process. We can never forget that. So here are all those laws, regulations, and procedures. Need I say anything more about this? And there's a lot more. This slide could keep going on forever. We all know the number and the details of the laws, the policies, etc. are very, very astronomical. There's a lot to know. But truth of the matter, the better we know them, the more we learn them, the better we understand the details, we can actually use the regulations to our benefit and our advantage. And when Mike McGuinn steps up, he'll talk about some of the concepts that you can use on how to utilize the space that some of these regulations outlay based on federal requirements. We also have the challenge of altering our existing facility. In fact, I'm sitting here in Atlanta right now, and I'm looking out my window, and this, in fact, might be the building I'm looking at. But either way, this is a very common design of a federal building from the 1970s. Very square, very industrial. Some of the pictures that Jose showed you earlier today. The federal workforce, though, is becoming much more blue collar. And so we have to adapt these buildings, or excuse me, much more white collar. So we have to adapt these buildings. We have to change the way in which we do business. And if you see in the bottom left, since 1998, we've seen an increase of the white collar workers in 9.8%. Like you can see across the board, the technical, the blue collar, the clerical, and the other white collar have gone down significantly. That means not only do we have to address the change in our workforce, the type of workforce, the culture of our workforce, it's also the type of work that the federal government is doing. And of course, we have to talk about technology adaptation. In some cases, the government does a great job. In most cases, they do not. Change continues to come at us rapidly. Technology is constantly changing and improving. And we must decide what technology to adapt. And when we do adapt or adopt that, how do we ensure that our workforce is able to adapt that technology and integrate it into what we're doing? And this, as you'll see further as we go into the presentation, ties into how we work and also, most importantly, how we design our spaces. And then, of course, there's the extensive military construction development process. This is everyone's favorite. Best case scenario, if you look at it, and this is if everything lines up, is that you can go from concept to construction, perhaps completion in 7 years. But with such rapid change in technology in our workforce, how do we anticipate the future and be adaptable in our designs in a very slow and deliberate process? So all these challenges exist, and all these challenges we must deal with. They're all going to continue to restrict the design and construction process. We've learned how to address and mitigate them to some degree as we've been going through our careers. But we hope in the rest of the presentation we give you some ideas that discuss concepts that can take federal facilities to the next level to enhance the creativity and collaboration of our organizations. And Mike, I'm going to transition this to you.
Okay. It's actually me, no?
Or actually, Jose.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, Jose again. In addition to that challenge, white-collar work has an elephant in the room, which is the disengaged workforce issue. There's been a number of studies, national as well as international studies. Some on the line may be familiar with the Gallup poll, State of American Workforce, the 2013 study, where it was a staggering number. The disengaged workforce is resulting in between $450 and $550 billion worth of lost productivity. So it's a significant number. The McLaren Group, the Washington consulting firm, did another parallel study, which was interesting. For every $10,000 of salary expended on white-collar workforce, approximately $3,400 is lost through lack of productivity and disengagement. So it's a big issue that really has a bottom-line impact on how the work is being produced, because ultimately work is a social endeavor. But it's not something that's just happening here in the States. One of our partners that we do quite a bit of work with, Steelcase, did an international study, and it occurs across industries and countries. 1 in 3 of international workers are also disengaged. At 41% of the workforce, according to Steelcase study, is engaged, which means that when you look at physical space, you almost need 3 people to do the work of 2. So one of the challenges is, you know, how can we figure out how to provide environments that create the engagement? And there's actually some lessons learned. When we looked at Fast Company, next slide please, there are a handful of national models of places that are places for collaboration, creativity, but people, more importantly, love their jobs. They're engaged and they're producing significant amounts of innovation. And you'll be familiar with some of these companies. They all experience 3 times the profitability of companies that are less engaged. So Airbnb, Bain Company, which is a consulting company out of Boston, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course the mother of all innovation companies, Google. And these are, you know, right off of their employee sites. Next slide, please. So, you know, what are they doing? And it's not that you're going to live in a toy like this image indicates, but one of the interesting things about it is that there is a real direct bottom line impact as to the profitability that these firms are realizing because of the retention of key staff, the attraction of top talent, and the productivity when they all synergize and are all rowing in the same direction. And this is the LinkedIn offices. Next slide. Facebook, again, another top 10 places to work. And of course, Pixar. And speaking of Pixar, Jobs was pointing out that the father of innovation almost is great things in business today are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people. So what we were thinking and what we've been doing in our work is figuring out what are the common elements that these organizations have. And one of the things that came to mind was that there's 2 types of vision that primarily are guiding business. One is, of course, the North Star, the big picture, the direction, which way are we going? That's provided by leadership. And then, of course, the telescopic thinking, which is understanding the details and how all the pieces come together. But in these companies that are these innovation companies, there's this kind of thinking which is the kaleidoscope thinking, which is taking bits and pieces of both of those extremes and recombining them, providing a kaleidoscope type experience that stems the or provides the innovation. Next slide. And that's something that Rosabeth Moss-Cantor from the Harvard Business School's, the Center for Innovation, wrote about, for those of you that may be familiar with her writings, which is trying to take combinations of different types of thinking and bringing them together to spark that innovation that requires business to continually reinvent itself and be competitive. And it's also the kind of thinking that we've all read about, design thinking, where you go through that brainstorming exercise to eventually narrow the thinking down to a more linear process where the innovation can be commercialized. One of the things that we found was that there tends to be places where a lot of this is happening naturally. And Ray Oldenburg, the sociologist, of course, wrote this book maybe 20 years ago, the famous third place, and we're all familiar with the Starbucks phenomenon, which is where we came up with this concept and has done quite a bit of research on it, which is the phenomenon of the third place. It's not work and it's not home. It's that interstitial type of a place. It's a place that promotes the exchange of ideas, that very kaleidoscopic thinking that I was mentioning. Also brings together a place of a shared community, people with like values, which creates the social bonds that could help bridge some of the generational divides that we had been talking about. There are also places that provide the rejuvenation to continue on working, especially in work environments that have extended hours and the 24/7, 365 work schedule. These types of third places are flexible enough where no matter what time of the day, you could come in and plug and play. And it provides also a place that fosters creative and intellectual development. So he wrote, these are all pieces of this great book. I highly recommend you guys pick this up. Next slide. But there were three basic ideas that seem to be constant through all of the examples in the book, and had to do with the whole notion of hosting. A hosting characteristic is what drives you to go there. What is it that you're doing? Is it a technology connection? Is it a cup of coffee? There's a purpose to go there. Also places that have distinct ambiances, so the experience itself is important to differentiate from the rest of the environment. And then, of course, technology, it has to be ubiquitous. So that's the place where you connect. So, Mike, can you pick it up here?
Yes, I'll pick it up from here. Thank you, Jose. So what we wanted to do was share some more the sort of practical application of what we've been talking about and how these factors all kind of come together for the different pieces of a facility and shaping the spaces that we have. And one of the things that I wanted to reference was a quote from Chris Flink from the Studio D. And one of the things that he was talking about was that the space and this, that the business occupies is the body language of the organization. How does it promote a certain culture and a certain identity? What that related to was the ability to recruit and attract and keep top talent. And that's what we were talking about early on, where there's going to, there is and there will be further a generation gap within all of industry, but also within the federal market and the federal workforce. And how do we start to deal with some of those conditions and affect change in our facilities to, again, be able to recruit, attract, and keep the best talent? And that goes to the new ecology of the organizational creativity and collaboration, and creating those spaces where people love to work. So the facility then acts as another tool to recruit and keep that great talent. So we're going to talk about some of those individual factors as we get the next slide to go. There we go. So the organizational third places that we talked about and as they started to discuss was the interstitial spaces. What does that mean in federal marketplaces? Because as we've been talking about this and Steve introduced the sort of time frame that the procurement and building process happens is over an extended period of time, yet our workforce and the work is changing at a much more rapid pace. What we found and what we're going to present today is that the spaces of these third places can happen within the interstitial spaces, the areas of connection, areas of circulation, and so forth, so that we can affect these changes now and they're not 7 years out. And we'll talk about those and present some of those items. The social connection platform and how everyone connects within these spaces is very important, and again creates a new identity of how we can bring the cross generations together. We'll talk about that in each of the items. Obviously fluid technology, and we'll talk a little bit about future-proofing. Technology continues to reinvent itself over and over again, and that's not just about Wi-Fi connections and wireless and so forth, power and so forth, but even the types of technology and the way that allows us to, again, connect, and we'll go over some of those. Intergenerational convergence, how do we create spaces that the older generation can be teaching the newer generation all that it has to share and sort of create a platform that encourages that, and we don't have sort of the bifurcation or separation of that type of asset of information. We're going to talk about collaborative and individual work areas, minimizing the need for private space and office spaces. That doesn't mean that they're going to be eliminated, but some of those areas are less desirable even by the new workforce, and we'll talk about some of those types of areas. And then distributed team integration. What does that mean? Well, with the mobile workforce and with being able to get to those that have the highest, not just credentials, but experience within each individual task, we need different ways that we can reach out to those team members. And they may be on different continents, different countries, different cities, different offices, and how do we bring everyone together? Go to the next slide. So again, to go back with that in mind with the third place is the hosting characteristics, the design attributes, and technology all really come together to sort of create a culture. And the culture of the space then allows us to not only define and sort of give that unspoken convey of what is important to that organization and how we bring people together and how we allow them to collaborate. We'll show those areas here as well. So some of those hosting characteristics in detail are sort of separated into specific attributes of spaces. And hosting typically means, printing support or access to technology. Typically, it also includes some sort of technology support. So if you have those that aren't necessarily as technology savvy, they have an easy way to be able to link in and not feel as though they're outside of the conversation or parts of the overall meetings. Office supplies, fundamental issues of, if those tools that are needed to support the activities that are happening are available, people will stay and people will work and people will collaborate. If those aren't there, it makes it difficult. And that goes to the next item with access to food and beverage and sort of the common things that people will need to keep them engaged. This goes back to, the idea of the coffee shop, and people can grab a coffee, they can grab a snack, and it encourages them to sit down for a moment and to continue the conversation. And that allows that within those office spaces as well. And then the on-site concierge, again, is typically having someone or a collection of people that can help facilitate those types of activities and keep everyone working. That improves the efficiency of the group and the overall efficiency of the space as well. The design attributes, again, goes to the look and feel, but also makes people feel comfortable to spend that time there. Architectural elements, variety of lighting and giving different effects that way, as well as artwork, artifacts, and branding. And then the overall creating a welcoming ambiance, someplace that people feel comfortable sharing and as well as facilitating the overall meeting spaces. Technology integration, as Jose mentioned earlier, is absolutely critical in the way that we communicate now. Less and less people are picking up the phones. More and more people are picking up, are sending emails or texts, and or then finding ways to communicate either through their devices. And that lends itself to, as we see here, with some of the areas where everyone has a computer in front of them, they have access to multiple screens, and the ability to share that information and present. They're not only developing content, but the desire to share that content throughout, not only within the office, but then across the phone lines. So presentation support, electronic scheduling to make sure everyone has access to those areas is important, and then content sharing tools as far as providing the types of technology that allows everyone to be able to link in and then link up together. So some of the types of spaces that we're going to present now are sort of described here, and they're purposely rebranded, if you will, because the intent is to convey the type of space and the attributes based off of the name so that it's a little more clear. They're not all conference type spaces. They become anchors, they become communal tables, flare spaces, individual areas, and so we're going to go through those now, the next couple of slides. So with the advent and then move towards more mobile and commuter type workforce, the anchor space has become something that has a sort of unique identity in that it's not a dedicated space for any one particular person, but allows them to be able to come in and have access to the technology and the resources and the community, if you will, of the office. You can see here, even in this image, providing for the recognized condition of, different types of workforces needing different functions as far as, maybe a single mother or a mother that has a child that needs to be picked up and sort of anchored in that time frame, allowing them to meet and have the flexibility to work that around their work life. One of the things that we have been talking quite a bit about is a work lifestyle. And so this facilitates this option to allow you to get the best talent with the best information and the best ideas, regardless of their family condition and other circumstances. Cave spaces are described as, and these can be done in a couple different ways, and we'll show you another example, where this allows for, with the advent of more open office and collaborative type functions, people still need at times to be able to disengage and then concentrate on select tasks. And so this is a furniture solution that allows for this to be sort of in a more compact distribution within spaces. But it's a less costly option because it's a furniture option utilizing existing space that allows for multiple staff to work on individual areas without necessarily dedicating full office spaces or full cubicles. These are small spaces for dedicated tasks, and the spaces are fit to the task that's needed. This is another example of sort of how those areas can then be combined together. So the previous one could be an old lobby space or another open office area, and this one might be able to be part of a circulation space or a widened corridor. Again, allowing people different flexible areas to be able to break out and have sort of concentrated effort and have that time to complete the task that's needed. Campfire spaces are another type of area where the furniture, the layout, and the space is dedicated exactly as the notion suggests, as sort of a campfire. It's an area where several people can gather. There's less and less need for large boardrooms and so forth, and those spaces can be rededicated to small collaborative areas adjacent to or with workspace areas. But the furniture is purposely lower. It's not designed to be as formal, so that you break down the walls and the challenges sometimes with communication, where people are sitting close together, they're huddled around a small area, and it also fosters a sense of trust and communication to allow for open, creative thinking. And so this is one type of space that we have here, and we'll show another example of a campfire area here, where tables or other pieces of the furniture and equipment is designed to, again, foster collaboration and allow for multiple ways of communicating between small groups of people. Huddle rooms are those areas that allow for, again, 4, 5, 6 people to gather, and they typically take the same amount of space as office or a cubicle space, so it allows for flexibility. Again, we're recognizing the constraints that some of the existing facilities have, and if you can repurpose one office to then facilitate small meeting spaces and allow people to gather, this would allow huddle areas typically have a little bit more privacy to allow for maybe some more sensitive communications to happen, as well as make it flexible and easy for those areas to happen immediately adjacent to or within the overall office workspace. The open kitchen. So that goes back to some of the ideas we were talking about before as far as what enables people to come together. Well, food is a common historical and cultural methodology for people to come together, and so a lot of different types of conversations and breakdown of barriers between different generations and different types of staff can happen around the old water cooler, and this enables people to come together, recognize obviously everyone as individuals, but allow them to have conversations they may not always have in sort of a more corporate world. And we've seen that with, as we've talked about earlier, with a flatter hierarchical structure for companies and for business. We recognize, obviously, there are certain pieces to that within DoD and other functions, but we're seeing more and more that's becoming flatter and allowing for more open communication. And that's the way that younger staff can sort of take advantage of the assets of the history, experience, and information that some of the older generations have. And these become areas that people traditionally feel more comfortable sharing and participating in. A larger example of that, and more formal example, is the next slide, which is sort of the work cafe. So that's sort of the adaptation and maturation of the open kitchen to where you actually might have sort of a kitchen area and then sort of an enlargement into adjacent workspaces that can be used for dining during certain times, but also can be used for collaboration and meeting spaces. Again, facilitating options that are a more relaxed atmosphere that allow people to gather and to share information. Rejuvenation spaces we found, and it's a lot of the research that we've seen, people need a break every once in a while, and it's more than just a break room, but they need an area where they can recharge, reconnect, and take a break from the sort of the heavy type of work, mental work that they're doing. As we talked about before, the type of work and the way we work has changed and will continue to change, and so these spaces offer staff the ability to take a break, clear the mind, change their posture, change their location, and a lot of times that is sort of the advent and what fosters the highest ability of creativity and collaboration within our staff. Communal tables and desking allows for a couple different options to happen, and here you can see a group where they're maybe have been working independently in their temporary desk locations, but also allows groups to come together and work collaboratively and adjacent to each other without necessarily upsetting or changing the way that the office works, allowing for not only communication, but the ability to physically share ideas and link in together through technology. The cul-de-sac space is typically these areas are not necessarily buried within the office areas, but can be shared off of open circulation areas as well as adjacent to large gatherings. And this can allow for both independent use as well as in shared use. Again, small areas that people can gather within or work within and give you flexibility of the types of areas that people feel comfortable working. You can see sort of change of posture, the ability for people to work the way that they feel the most comfortable, allowing for the highest creativity. Flare spaces we found are another dynamic of areas where these are just pull-off areas, and this one's a little larger than you typically see, but pull-off areas off of main circulation spaces where people can take a moment as they pass each other in the corridor, talk about the topic that they may need to be meeting about or discussing, allowing for that personal interaction in lieu of just sending an email. What we've seen in some of the research is that people, if they have to walk more than 65 feet, they typically will tend to send an email, not even pick up the phone. But if we can create spaces where people interact with each other and allows for a more open dialogue, usually we can solve those items within a 15-minute conversation versus a 4-day exchange of emails. Here you can see those spaces can both be flexible to be more formalized and group meeting areas that can be closed off, or can be just, areas where they gather and are solving a problem on the wall so they can figure out and share within the overall community, allowing for others to participate as well and bring in multiple participants. Team centers and especially the distribution, allowing for those team areas, and increasingly we're seeing teams be not only a group of people in one office, but also working collaboratively with offices around the world or other organizations and owners all over the world, and having a space that people can come together, have access to technology, and be able to work collaboratively close to their work area is increasingly more important, so that they can foster that idea of communication and not feel that they are sort of separated and or working independently. Individual connected spaces, as we said before, they still have a role, but maybe their role is changing slightly in the way that they're used to adapt and be more collaborative. Here you can see the desk is turned towards the wall, recognizing that for individual tasks and work time, that can still be fostered, but the office is opened up to very openly indicate that the idea of collaboration and meeting is more important than the individual workspace. As things are becoming more technology-based and less paper-oriented, this only encourages the idea and is fostered to the idea of having less individual workspace and more collaborative areas. So open spaces, less walls, lower square footage overall, and lower cost are all the possibilities of where workspaces are going. These opportunities allow you also to be tailored and specific to the mission that's happening and is needed. So furniture solutions and office spaces have a lot higher role in how those spaces are defined, but that gives you flexibility so that those areas can be changed and meet the mission that's needed. Technology integration, there's lots of different opportunities, even utilizing older equipment and furniture with some small ideas as far as making technology more accessible. Providing for the varied and tailored and adaptable spaces, you can see how meeting areas can be switched out, individual workstations can be utilized, and sort of given that the flexibility within an overall space, general lighting and so forth. This area can be reconfigured in multiple different ways to be utilized for the specific needs that are required. Some of the more common spaces that we can see even in very current buildings, if we can leverage common areas and service areas for some of these functions, these are spaces that maybe are a little more underutilized in our existing facilities, and they present great opportunities to incorporate and sort of set the tone of the building and offering for collaboration and creativity right at the front door. So we provided, and I'm sure you'll see all of this if you download the presentation, but the different types of space and then the attributes as far as which areas foster higher communication versus independent work, dispersion of work, the continual reorganization and restructuring, which ones are highest and most flexible for that piece, those areas that are offering highest efficiency as far as the use of space, but also reducing costs towards construction. And then we move all of them, generally improve the quality of the work life and lifestyle, and improve the ability for recruitment of the new generation of workforce. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Jose to wrap up with some of the takeaways.
Well, thanks, Mike. So as Mike was pointing out, and it's the first one is, of course, the cliche, is people are our most valuable assets. But especially where Steve was picking up, there's a lot of new people that are being introduced into the workforce. So the idea is not just simply the challenges that presents, but the opportunities to provide this cross-generational workforce and the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of skill sets between the workforce. And recognizing that the people have a lot of choices as to where they're going to be spending their time and contributing their passion. And the space really needs to raise the bar as far as attracting and resonating with specifically the younger group of people that we've been focusing on that have different work habits that may not be as comfortable in the cubicle. In addition to that is what happens when that workforce fuses and you start creating that synergy into a unified workforce, working better together than apart. So what we tried to present today was the ecology that we believe and we've been utilizing to make this happen in existing facilities. It's been intentionally biased in furniture solutions because we know that that's the easiest way to jumpstart this type of program. But we've realized also that it also has a bottom line impact in increasing productivity and also lowering perhaps the need for construction costs in subdividing space and fragmenting space, and ultimately create environments that are engaging, innovative, and provide better working solutions that could be implemented to make our businesses and organizations thrive and prosper. So with that, we'll open the floor to questions. Rad, maybe you want to wrap it up for us?
Sure. I think we've gotten a number of questions from our audience. I will go to the first bunch of those, and then we'll see if that generates some additional thoughts. But the first one is what is being proposed adaptable to be implemented within current approved programs and budgets? I mean, you've spoken about a lot of things: the cave, the campfire, the huddle. Frequently, that runs up against a space program that comes from the federal government. How do you merge the two, and how do you deal with those at the same time in the same building?
Hey, Rad, before we jump into Q&A, I'd like to bring Tom Palace and Christine Hargraves back in the round, give them an opportunity just to offer their expertise and experience in the topic.
Great. Christine?
Thank you, Steve and Rad. As I said, I'm Chris Hargreaves. I appreciate everybody participating today. I'm an architect with CH2M Hill, as Rad mentioned earlier, and I've programmed and designed military and other federal facilities throughout my career, including over 20 years for CH2M Hill. I've developed voluntary security and anti-terrorism force protection standards as well, so I tend to work more on facilities that have some pretty extreme security demands, which are interesting to balance with some of the types of beautiful spaces that Jose and Mike and others were showing you today. My own experience for the past 14 years has focused on operations facilities for intel missions of our military. And when I first started working on this facility type, the technology and security really drove the building standards, the building design concepts and solutions. But the military has been refocusing in the last few years more on the analysts who are the personnel who are fundamentally driving the mission. The military is recognizing that they too, as was mentioned throughout this presentation, they're competing for the sharpest personnel within the tech industry, and also finding that the unique stressors of intel mission tasks can adversely impact their health and wellness, and that in turn result in reduced productivity and a variety of health issues. So there's a lot of awareness, a growing awareness that I've observed of the benefits of providing the flexible and diverse workspaces that were discussed today. Spaces that support more collaboration, as well as balance that with spaces for the more focused tasks. And when we do design of both the secure and functional operations environments, we need to augment those with the support spaces that facilitate the rejuvenation as well as transition between the tasks, including transition between duty and off-duty. And that's where I see that those third places become really important in the types of facilities that I work on. Just a couple more comments I wanted to make, that reflecting on the multi-generational perspectives that they discussed in the slides. I've been really excited to see that many of the requests from the clients I work with are coming from senior leadership, people that have the vision to recognize the benefits of providing these kinds of workspaces for their units, their personnel. They're asking for things like caves and commons and dog bones and benching solutions and rejuvenation spaces by those names. So it's really exciting to see that the military workplace is evolving just as they've discussed today. Thank you.
And this is Tom.
Tom, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. And I appreciate everyone's time today and getting the opportunity to speak. My name is Tom Powell. I'm a senior associate with Booz Allen Hamilton, and I'm responsible for our firm's work supporting the Army Reserve component installations. We're not any firm. We focus more on facilities policy, facility strategy, portfolio management, and those sorts of things. And what we've noticed, especially on the Department of Defense side, is the past several years have been very difficult in terms of obtaining MILCON funding, of obtaining sustainment, restoration, modernization funding, and the Army in particular has taken the conscious decision to accept a fair amount of risk in their facilities portfolio. So that's the environment that our clients are dealing with, and what we're doing is helping them through how do we manage in that sort of austere environment. And part of the answer is we've been helping towards viewing the facilities portfolio as an asset to be used as opposed to a liability to be maintained. And what I mean by that, there's various initiatives and trends coming out for the government to use their facilities in ways they haven't really thought of before that generate some sort of value. And that ranges from partnerships with local communities, for example, in the Army Reserve, to use those facilities when the Army is not, down to the sorts of discussion we had today around using the facility as a way to increase productivity and essentially a force multiplier. So these sorts of considerations have increasingly become not nice to haves, but crucial as our clients are working through their facility policy and facility strategy. So thanks for your time today, and really enjoyed being here.
Thanks, Tom, and Chris and Tom are available to answer our questions as well. Back to the question that came in earlier. How do you implement these with current programs and budgets, and how do you accommodate the additional spaces that we need to make these facilities work better?
This is Mike McGuinn from Zyscovich, and I'll answer a portion of this, and I'd also like to get Christine's impression on some of these as well, based on her introduction. What we've seen is that generally the program areas allow for appropriate circulation and grossing factor within the overall programs, and if used efficiently, there are many opportunities for new facilities, even though 1391s have been defined, to be adapted. And as Christine presented earlier, we're seeing this come from leadership, that they recognize that these spaces, even though they may be circulation or they may be break areas or they may be conference spaces, can be adapted in the ways that some of the images that we showed, so that they're utilized in their most highest efficient use to enable collaboration and enable creativity. And so we aren't ignoring the fact that there will be a lot of safety and security type conditions with sensitive information and so forth that needs to be protected, and the physical environment will continue to recognize that condition. However, there are those other spaces as we look at the programs that people are working within. As Christine mentioned, the analysts and sort of the highest and brightest tech analysts that we need to recruit in the type of new mission that the military has, and how do we make sure that they are recognizing they have the right types of work lifestyle and space to be on the cutting edge of all of these other markets and conditions that they need to be addressing. So Christine, maybe you can participate in that conversation as well.
Sure, thank you. I agree with that. That being said, I do spend a lot of time promoting programming studies to our clients. I gave a webinar a few weeks ago through SAME. If you have a chance to listen to the recorded version of that, we talk about the benefits of really looking at things upstream and understanding what exactly is needed to do the mission that's housed in a facility, whether it's a new project, a new MilCon, or a renovation. I'm currently working with several Air Force clients, for example, and we're doing feasibility studies of existing buildings to determine how best to implement some of these very concepts, as well as the secure operations environments that are needed within buildings that were really not designed to support those. So we help to define what those requirements are, and that helps us give them the budgetary information needed to defend their requests. So that advanced planning is really important to ensure. You can't do a military intelligence facility for the same budget that you do, a storage building or even a typical administrative office building. So that recognition is really key.
I think one of the other pieces to that is that for those existing facilities and areas that are being adapted and modified, as you mentioned, there are some of those that provide certain constraints. We purposely showed a lot of images of the types of furniture and equipment that can be utilized in any of these types of spaces that will adapt the functions to meet some of those needs. So furniture also plays a large role in the ability to shape those spaces as well.
On that topic of furniture specifically, we had a question about that. What are the options? Do you have the availability within government contracts to go to the appropriate vendors for these furniture and equipment options?
This is Mike from Zyscovich. We've seen most of the furniture vendors and industry moving towards having options similar, just like what we presented. We showed a lot of images of Steelcase, which is part of the an approved vendor for any of the DoD work. But we're seeing this throughout industry. As they presented, there's multiple options and ways that people are implementing these types of strategies across all markets. And so there's multiple vendors that are available. If anyone wants something in more particular, we'd be happy to sort of answer and provide more information following this presentation as well.
Hey, Mike, if I may add on that too, this is Steve Williamson. Actually, if you go back to some of the regulations that I presented, I think it's back on slide number 24, there is actually a GSA regulation that, and interestingly enough, is really presenting some of the similar concepts that we did. Yeah, I think it's right there in the middle. That one with the brown there. If you really through there, they actually start to begin to talk about the need for that type of furniture, that type of space. So I think they recognize the changes. It's just that we need to start finding the vendors that can support the contracts that can actually affect these changes.
Well, and those vendors are out there and available. I think the challenge is that typically a lot of the DoD market has not sort of engaged them in providing those types of furniture. But as Christine mentioned, we're seeing a lot more of the owners and leadership recognizing these conditions and starting to change the way that they're buying their office furniture and the furniture for these various third places.
If I could chime in there too, GSA is really kind of leading the way. They've renovated their headquarters following a lot of these concepts, and they're willing to give tours to folks that have federal customers that might benefit from seeing how the workspaces can be put into action. And they also will customize some of the facility standards especially for military customers that don't normally use GSA standards, but they can give examples that are real world and how it's benefiting productivity in their own workspaces, how the flexible furniture systems work. One other comment on that, there's a lot of different systems on schedule, on the GSA schedules that our military customers can tap into. I don't see anything that you've presented today that wouldn't be available from multiple furniture vendors. We also augment that through the Furniture, Fixture, and Equipment program, funding the FF&E, with demountable partition systems that can either be provided as part of the furniture program or as part of the building, depending on how they're funded and how they're integrated into the design effort. And that also provides some additional flexibility options, including different types of partitions, different acoustical benefits, switchable glass partitions, and things like that. So there's a lot of different options available to federal customers.
And to add to that, mentioning of GSA, but the Corps of Engineers, their new Seattle office, has exactly the same type of activities and spaces that they've been creating. So you know, all of these organizations that support the various parts of DoD are doing it within their own office spaces to show just how important it is within their own mission.
Jose, you mentioned Seattle. Are there any good examples of these spaces in the DC area?
You know, we'll have to research that to get more detail to it. I'm sure there are, but we'll have to find some of those, and we'll share that with the group.
If I could answer part of that as well, certainly GSA headquarters offers some good examples, and I can give people a contact if they need one. There's also spaces like WeWork that exist in many large cities. I know the one in downtown DC provides some great examples of the things that they were talking about today. If you're not familiar with WeWork, it's space that can be leased by various businesses depending on their needs. It has large shared spaces like the work cafe type areas. They have what they call a living room in the one in downtown DC, not too far from DuPont Circle. So that's a great example of many of these concepts.
That's a great reference.
How do these options function with the multiple generations that we started our discussion with? How do the different generations deal with the variety of spaces? I wonder how part of the older generation might deal with some of the new and work in some of the new space setups.
Well, this is Mike from Zyscovich. What we found is that not only is it cross-generational, but everyone has a different way, you know, start from our education side of our practice as well. Everyone learns and works differently. And so aside from just some of the generational characteristics, we found that different people need different ways of working and different ways of learning, and then therefore collaborating and creating. And so what we found is that the very types of spaces offer for some of the independent or individual characteristics of staff, but the communal spaces are where generally people can come together. Those more traditional areas that people come together and sort of some of the we mentioned the baby boomers and that older generation. We found that they really sort of tend to foster and collaborate better in those areas such as the open kitchen and cafe areas and small huddle spaces where people can have a moment to connect. Once the connection is made, then collaboration and open communication and dialogue is a little easier. But that sort of recognizes that still as people work and differently throughout not only time but also in their independent needs, the varied types of spaces are important. And so, as we said earlier, the independent spaces aren't going away completely. This isn't just a total open office area, as some of the images might suggest. The varied types of spaces need to be provided that foster the different ways that people work. Christine, I don't know if you can offer more to that, not only for the generational, but also some of the security aspects that you've seen in some of the facilities you've designed.
You know, military facilities tend, to me, they don't seem to have those generational differences. I know they exist, but once the vision is established for the buildings that I've worked on, it seems like people tend to embrace it pretty quickly. But I know in other types of office environments, including our own office environment, we have one of these sort of work cafe environments, and people refer to it as the office Arby's because of the way the seating is, the older people. But you know, people are gradually getting adjusted to using it and finding the opportunities in evolving their work styles, I think. So it is different for everybody and every workplace setting, but as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people that are senior leadership have embraced these concepts pretty enthusiastically and are excited to see what they can do with them. So,
a little more detail on a point that you raised earlier, Christine. Is there anything special about the secure spaces or any special requirements for those secure spaces relative to what we've been talking about, or is it just you just have to, how do you adjust this mix of spaces?
You know, one of the biggest challenges we see is that the secure facilities for Intel missions generally don't allow personal technology devices to be taken inside the buildings. And that's a real shift for the younger generation in particular, and any of us that are accustomed to checking our, you know, text messages and emails and so forth using a smartphone or a tablet or other such devices. So some of the strategies that we've used to allow a different way of tapping into the same kind of information is to put things like walk-up computer workstations where people can check emails casually without having to go to a private office or something like that. We have network cafes for different levels of networks that are pretty close to the actual break areas, so they work kind of like the cafes that were discussed. But we're not allowed to put Wi-Fi in these buildings, and there's certain technology constraints that really are imposed by the security requirements. We also, you know, the pictures that you showed today, lovely pictures, lots of bright sunlit spaces, lots of views. And many of the secure buildings have to either they don't have windows in the operations environments themselves, or they, because of security constraints, or they have to have blinds on the windows that are virtually closed most of the time. And that's an operational issue, but you don't get the opportunities for that in every workspace. So the work cafes, for example, can provide an opportunity for that visual respite and that exposure to daylighting and views that's in contrast to other workspaces. So we find ways to try and integrate these concepts the best we can and still have to address the security constraints because they dictate, they govern.
More and more companies are allowing employees to telecommute, and this obviously requires at the very least some kind of technological accommodation. How is that being dealt with, especially given what you just described, as well as the government pushback against connectivity because of some of their cybersecurity issues? How do you deal with telecommuting in these environments?
Are you asking?
Asking whoever feels comfortable answering.
Well, I'll take a shot at starting it at least. The GSA headquarters that I mentioned, that was one of their objectives. They wanted to reduce their footprint and provide opportunities for people to telework. So I believe they reduced their facility footprint by about a third for their own headquarters functions. And they don't have the same security constraints that the Intel facilities I work on have. For the most part, they allow people to walk around with laptops, and they allow people to work at home and have access to all of the online resources that they need. But when you're talking an Intel mission, that definitely has different constraints, and most of those folks aren't. I'm not aware of any teleworkers, although there are certainly people that travel frequently and have secure laptops that they can take in and out of the secure facilities. So that's just my experience. I'm sure the others have plenty to add.
Well, and this is Mike from Zyscovich. What we've seen as well is for those existing facilities where the property is owned or are currently being utilized or can't be leased out and parsed, we've seen that they also have the flexibility then to grow staffing and flex with their needs without necessarily having to acquire additional space. So areas can be contracted a little bit, as Christine mentioned, upwards of a third of the space, lending for higher utilization of areas and not necessarily affecting the bottom line as far as having to acquire additional space to facilitate the change in mission or need. So we have seen an increase in that flexibility, as well as the overall workspaces, and Christine, maybe you could speak to that, what you've seen in some of your other options, where the overall workspaces, as they condense, they allow for more of these other types of spaces to be created.
Absolutely. That provides the flexibility for people that are teleworking for the most part to come in and meet, in the campfire environment, for example, or other types of huddles or collaborative workspaces when they need to. So those become really key to that being successful. I wanted to add one other thing, though, that most federal facilities now, I believe, require a building information model, a BIM model, when they're under design. Often, more and more often, we'll see that even for renovated buildings, that we'll create a model for those. And those models have the opportunity to build in intelligence, and we're also starting to see some of our clients looking to use that intelligence to better manage their workspace and control how that, the footprint can be better utilized. They're seeing that they might have a 30 to 40% vacancy rate in private office use, for example, and they can then make hotel type spaces and other types of spaces like those discussed today available to folks that travel frequently or just don't simply need that private office environment. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to harness the intelligence of the BIM models to the benefit of our customers as well.
Has there been any effort to quantify these changes? I know DODEA did something with their the school classroom of the 21st century a few years ago. Has any, you mentioned the GSA, has any government agency gone in and, as opposed to just giving out the standard space requirements, have they gone in and how have they done it to quantify some of the things you've been talking about here? Or is this something that we're expected to do on a project-by-project basis?
This is Mike from Zyscovich. As Christine presented, GSA and so the Corps and other agencies that sort of provide the program management for a lot of their other parts of DOD and the federal government are utilizing within their own areas, but they're also taking those lessons learned and sharing them along with the various AEs like Christine and her group are doing as well. But we happen to have a contract with the Corps of Engineers out of Norfolk and are supporting DODEA, as you mentioned before. And they're doing similar things within the educational spaces and sort of redefining the way that military personnel and their families participate within the community and the educational environment, as well as the way the students learn. And that's part of what we were discussing a little earlier, is that creating individualized opportunities and ways that people learn and collaborate is directly affecting the way that DODEA is planning their facilities in providing for multiple types of varied types of spaces to independently and effectively address the way that everyone learns in a different way. And so without going into a lot of detail there, we do see that, as Key mentioned before, multiple agencies are affecting this throughout their programs. The ability to do it quickly is always a challenge, but the commitment to it, and if we're getting senior leadership requesting it, that's the key. Finding the champion that's going to enable it to happen and support it allows us as architects and as the facility designers to have the ability to make these types of spaces real.
Thanks, Mike. I think we're getting down to the bottom of the hour, and there'll be a few comments to wrap up. But before we do, I'd like to go back to our panelists and see if they have any final comments they'd like to make, anything to wrap things up in general.
Right, I think we're good on our side from Zyscovich.
Okay, Christine or Tom?
I'm good. I appreciate everybody's time.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our presenters for their hard work in developing this presentation. On behalf of SAME, I want to express our appreciation to you and everyone who participated today. We hope our webinar has been valuable. I'd also suggest that you visit the SAME website, specifically the Committees and Council page, which will allow you to drill down to the Architectural Practice Committee pages. And you can see what's coming. You will, as I mentioned earlier, you'll be getting an email with information, more detail on question answers, as well as how to get a copy of the presentation. So this concludes our webinar. You're now welcome to disconnect. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.